Thank you, everyone, for joining me for these live internet studies. They are an hour and a half long. Each study is an hour and a half long. There's 2 segments. The first segment is 1 hour long. It's entitled Eschatology, a Biblical Study of End Time Events. It is a topic where I work through, as you can probably see on your screen right now if you're watching the YouTube video, I work through a topic each week with a view towards the book of Revelation. If you can see topic 15 and 16, I'm working my way towards that. We're in topic 11 right now, making a case for the Prewrath view of the rapture. So basically, eschatology is the study of end-time events, end-time things. That's why it's called eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. I defined the word eschatology within the title of the study itself. The second 30-minute segment is entitled A Trinitarian Response to Biblical Unitarianism, and we're working our way not verse by verse, but select passage by select passage that's chosen actually by a non-Trinitarian Christian denomination by the name of Biblical Unitarian. They've got a website called Biblical Unitarianism. BiblicalUnitarian.com is the website we're using, and they've got a collection of verses that historically are understood to be Trinitarian verses, but Biblical Unitarian has taken upon themselves to say, hey, we don't think these verses are Trinitarian, we think they're Unitarian. So, and we'll tell you, here's why we think it is. And so I've taken it upon myself to go back into those same verses and say, not so fast, Biblical Unitarian, let's re-examine. So, if you like that type of topic, then stick around for both of them. All right, let's jump into the eschatology study itself. Like I said, we're on topic 11, making a case for the Prewrath view, and I've been parked out on this for a while because it's the view that I hold to, and I'm trying to convince you. So what are these views? Well, according to my research, there's about 4 different views. Give me a second. I forgot to open up my little tool. There we go. So this first view is right here in the upper left corner. It's called Pre-Tribulation Rapture. And to understand all of these 4 views, just real quick before I rattle these off and then jump right into the study. To understand these 4 views, you kind of have to understand that there is this concept known as a 7-year time frame that most people have been taught is labeled the 7-year tribulation. And I don't hold to that label, but I do hold to the time frame. I think that there truly is 7 years that is marked out by God in which some significant prophetic events will be played out over the 7-year period. So in order to understand each one of these views, you have to understand that there's 7 years. So meaning if I go like this, I'm circling with my arrow. The first view, called the pre-tribulation rapture, believes that the rapture of the Christian church, the snatching away of all Christians, will take place right here at the very beginning of the 7-year period, and they call themselves pre-tribulation rapture. They believe that the church will be raptured before this final 7 years, known as Daniel's 70th week. Now, Daniel's 70th week is a term that I prefer to call this 7-year time frame. They call it a 7-year tribulation, but that's their perspective. Moving along, this second view is called mid-tribulation rapture, and they are so called because right in the middle of the 7 years, there's that thing called rapture, the snatching away of Christians up to be with Jesus, right in the midpoint of the 7 years. They believe the rapture will occur exactly halfway through the 7-year period, just before the beginning of the Great Tribulation. Moving along, on the lower left corner, there's a view called Posttribulation Rapture, and for them, I'll circle it for you, their belief is that the rapture will occur following the 7-year period known as Daniel's 70th week. So it's really just flip it on the other side of what the Pretribbers said. Not a rapture at the beginning of the 7 years, but a rapture at the far end. We're going to be talking more about them tonight. This is the classic view of Posttrib. The last view on my list is this one called Prewrath Rapture in the lower right corner. And this view takes the perspective that The rapture, which I'm circling kind of, the rapture is an event that will occur following the opening of the sixth seal of the book of Revelation. So as far as timing, that sixth seal is not quite at the midpoint, but it's not quite at the end either. It's somewhere between the midpoint, so it's after the midpoint, but it's before the end of the 70th week. This is when the church will be raptured, and the church will experience severe persecution by the Antichrist, in other words, the Great Tribulation, but they will be snatched away, and this is the key point of the pre-wrath view. They will be snatched away before God begins to pour out his wrath during the day of the Lord. So that's a defining feature of this pre-wrath rapture. Is it's in the name. The rapture is pre-wrath of God. But as we're going to find out, there's another view here that is labeled post-trib pre-wrath, circling it on your screen right now. And this is basically a modified version of the classic post-tribbers. So what they do is when it comes to rapture and wrath, I'm circling it right now on the lower right corner. It's still the lower left corner perspective, but in the 7-year schema of things, the rapture is placed in front of the day of the Lord. And in so doing, it creates a feature that was already present in all of the other three views. That is, that the rapture is that Christians don't go through the day of the Lord. And so, I mean, if you look at it, if you notice, in pre-trib view, the rapture was in front of the day of the Lord, right? Pre-trib had that all along. Mid-trib picked up the same concept. Rapture was in front of the day of the Lord. And the pre-wrath also had the same concept. Rapture took place first, then the day of the Lord took place second. So I think that it is worth noting that when the post-trib pre-wrath view kind of started finding its articulation among teachers, they probably began to realize the strength of coming on board with the idea that the rapture must be prior to the day of the Lord. Maybe that's just shows the progression of people studying together more, the influence, the cross-influence that these views have with each other. So going back to the four rapture views, for the longest time, post-tribbers were kind of the odd man out. They just believed that Christians would go through all of God's wrath. I mean, notice the length of God's wrath on this post-trib chart. I don't know if this is accurate, but God's wrath was the entire 7 years. And this is very similar to the pre-trib, which was also had a 7-year God's wrath tribulation time period. The mid-tribbers, they had their God's wrath great tribulation time period cut in half the length. And then the pre-wrath rapture is famous for having even a smaller yet slice of God's wrath. But nevertheless, something that all three pre-wrath, mid-trib, and post-trib taught for the longest time is that we are exempt from God's wrath. It was only the post-tribbers that were kind of sitting out there by themselves saying, no, we're going to go through all of it. We're going to go through the trib and the God's wrath, and God's just going to somehow supernaturally protect us. But then along comes the post-trib pre-wrath. But I also want you to know that pre-wrath, in its name pre-wrath, puts our rapture after the tribulation. So let me pull up a different slide so you can see this. Those are the biblical references. This is Alan Kurschner's version of it. We could see it. No, let me see if this one's... no, I want to show you. I guess I can stick here then. This will be good enough for me. Notice, and I'll jump into the study right after this. Notice that the rapture is right here with this white arrow pointing up. But notice where the rapture is. It is after the Great Tribulation, but before the day of the Lord. So the rapture is that event that cuts short the Great Tribulation, but it's that same event that initiates the wrath of God or the day of the Lord. And this is important by way of timing because and by way of theology, because when we take Yeshua's words at face value in Matthew 24:29, he says immediately after the tribulation of those days, the context being the Great Tribulation. But then when we look at passages that go all the way back to the Old Testament, there is this sign in the heavens that we call the cosmic disturbances, where the sun, moon, and stars behave strangely. And that sign is the precursor that the day of the Lord is about to commence. And so with that sign that goes all the way back to Isaiah chapter 13, I believe, and Joel chapter 2. I could be getting it wrong. Well, we got the Joel mentioned up here. Joel 2:1, 2 Thessalonians 2:2. I didn't put the Isaiah passage in there, but I think it's Isaiah 13. I could be wrong. I'll flash it in post-production so you can see. The important point is that these things start giving us markers of chronology as to when things are going to be happening. All right, what have we been talking about? I created this slide, this miniature, what do I call it, an essay, called Posttrib, Prewrath, Rapture, Smackdown, and we're on part 2. Posttrib, Prewrath is a smackdown between these two positions. What I'm doing is I'm pitting classic post-tribulational rapture views against pre-wrath rapture views and trying to examine their similarities and differences. And so I say in kind of joking fashion, hint, whoever wins, Pretrib loses. Mwahahaha, yeah. What I call my little evil LOL. So what I did is, last week I began this, and I got some reasonable feedback from the chart. This is really the theology is a repeat of what I talked about in Smackdown Part 1, but I just put it in chart form for ease of understanding for those of you who are chart people. But I got some reasonable feedback and a little bit of pushback, and it's healthy pushback. Part of the pushback from post-tribbers is that they just can't hold to a second coming that's separate from a rapture, two separate events. And so I retooled this particular slide. I also was able to figure out how to make the colors the way I wanted to. Last time I bemoaned the fact that I couldn't get my columns to match somewhat in color with the heading, the column heading. So if you notice, we've got an orange column heading called aspect, and then I've got a like a definitional topic that we're talking about. Moving left to right, I've got a green column called classic post-tribulational rapture, and then the definition given there. And then from left to right, after the green one, we got the blue, Prewrath Rapture on your right side, and then all of the definitions. And earlier version, if you watch last week's video, the cells were just white and gray. They didn't match, so which means once you lost the table heading, you couldn't really tell which one was which if you didn't remember. But I was able to figure out how to color code them, so taught myself a new trick this week. Okay, so this is also an updated version when it comes to some of the nomenclature. I was embarrassed that my first draft didn't really express the definitions the way that I really wanted them to be, and so I retooled it and reworded some of the definitions. So what I'm going to do is, just real quick, we only made it to the wrath of God anyway, the fourth one down. So I'm going to reread some of them. Aspect, timing of the rapture, according to the classic post-trib rapture, the green, occurs at the, let me just highlight it like that so you can see which one I'm talking about, occurs at the end of the tribulation at Christ's second coming. The pre-wrath rapture says that it occurs after the Great Tribulation, but before God's wrath, which is the sixth seal. So it's a timing issue there. Which one of us is right? I'm not entirely certain which one of us is absolutely correct. You know, basically, he who knows when the rapture starts is the same person who knows when the wrath of God begins, because both of us agree that the wrath of God and the rapture are closely connected with one another. Even classic post-tribbers, I believe, as we're going to see later on down in my research, some versions of them divide the wrath of God up between the trumpet judgments and the bowl judgments, and in so doing, Christians go through the trumpet judgments, but they don't go through the bowl judgments. Something like that. All right, second one. Nature of the rapture and the second coming. Here's where we get a lot of heavy disagreement. The classic post-tribbers say that the rapture and the second coming are one event. What do the pre-raptors say? The rapture and the second coming are one parousia that includes both an initiating event and a culminating event. This is represents a change on my side. I don't know if you guys can see that. Let me do this. I might just try to circle them. I'm right there right now. Not a very good circle. But the big difference between these the big difference right here, sorry. The big difference between these two events, right? I'm talking about these two right here. The big difference is that the post-tribbers say that, and accurately, they double down on this, really. I mean, many of the teachers that I hold in high respect as far as eschatology and biblical exposition and things like that, I'm just singling in my mind out two of them. I'm going to say Joel Richardson and Dr. Michael Brown. I've been following both of their studies for quite some length of time, but both of them are post-tribbers. I'm not exactly sure if Dr. Brown is a classic post-tribber, but Joel Richardson uses the term hybrid, meaning he's a bit sympathetic for some of the pre-wrath truths, namely that the church will not have to go through the wrath of God. How much of it? I think he believes that we won't go through any of the wrath of God. Dr. Brown, I believe, is closer to the classic version, if I'm correct, that he believes that we will have to just be protected by God while we're here on earth. But then after the Battle of Armageddon, the final wrath of God will be poured out, that 30 days or something. It's really unclear as to exactly how much of the wrath of God we go through. But germane to my point is that this has always been a point of disagreement between pre-wrath and post-trib, is that there is one second coming or one coming of the Lord, and yet this either means that the rapture and the second coming, so-called, are the same event. That would be classic post-trib, or they're two events, but connected to one another by the term parousia or term second coming, depending on which one you're looking at. And again, I'm going to do a whole show just on this aspect, because this seems to be a recurring disagreement among these two, and a recurring tipping point of disagreement that causes enough people to kind of switch one camp or the other. Because otherwise, if you haven't noticed yet, much of what these two views hold to is identical. Post-trib and pre-wrath, they have a lot of similarities. So let's just keep going. Tribulation period. This is a recap anyway, so I don't want to spend too much time. According to the classic post-tribbers, the entire 7-year period is understood to be the tribulation period. Recall that previous slide here. You can see that the tribulation period, or God's wrath, they're synonymous. They overlap, and there's just differing degrees. The first 3.5 years is the lesser tribulation, and the final 3.5 is the great tribulation. And this concept is carried through the first 3 of the 4 views: upper left, upper right, lower left. They all have a tribulation compared with a great tribulation. It's the pre-wrathers that are out there in left field. Well, that's a poor analogy when they're really on the right corner. They are the ones who break away from this nomenclature of a tribulation and a great tribulation. So going back to here, the entire 7-year period is understood to be the tribulation period, with a tribulation and a great tribulation separating the 7 into 3.5 and 3.5. However, by comparison, the Prewrath Rapture says there's no official tribulation period. Instead, there are the birth pangs, the first 3.5 years, as well as the Great Tribulation, a time period beginning at the midpoint but cut short before the 3.5 years is completed. So that, before the final 3.5 years is completed. And maybe I should have put final 3.5 years there, but oh well. This is, again, a big difference between these two. I also rewrote the Wrath of God one, so now we're right here. Wrath of God. by way of definition from a post-trib perspective, wrath of God is synonymous with the day of the Lord. This time period of unspecified duration begins after the Battle of Armageddon, or maybe begins shortly before the Battle of Armageddon or something. I have tried to get a more accurate or understandable definition of the wrath of God from a post-trib resource, and no matter what I do, I just can't seem to find it. I can't seem to get a clear point as to when they believe the wrath of God begins. Maybe that's because, from their perspective, the wrath of God is just something that's near the end of the week. And maybe it initiates with Armageddon, maybe it culminates with Armageddon. They don't tell me exactly how long it is. That's why I say unspecified duration in my slide here, or in my chart here. Nevertheless, by comparison, in the blue section, the Prewrath says that the wrath of God is a time period possibly 5 months to 1 year long, initiated by the rapture, which includes the 7 trumpets and 7 bowls, but not the 7 seals, and which culminates at the Battle of Armageddon. So that's our perspective, and we hold to that because of certain passages that seem to follow in a natural, chronological, sequential fashion, namely when we get to the book of Revelation, where we start getting a lot more detail that's granular, that's zoomed in for us on purpose, versus if we just stuck to the books of the Gospels and Paul's letters, we would always forever be in too much of a zoom out mode. We Prewrathers believe that a key factor in understanding eschatology is to take the book of Revelation extremely seriously, to the point that we believe it should be understood in a natural, customary fashion. Most of it being read in a chronological fashion, but we'll get to that in time. Great Tribulation. Okay, we left off here last week with the wrath of God, and we hadn't really got into the Great Tribulation, so now we're into new material. The Great Tribulation, according to the green part, remember on my chart here, is the post-trib rapture perspective. The Great Tribulation, according to post-tribbers, the Great Tribulation and God's wrath are often seen as synonymous. So, on another vein, we could say that the post-trib is simply the first 3.5 years. The Great Tribulation is the second half of the 70th week, or the 7-year tribulation, and this is compared to the tribulation itself. But the Great Tribulation and God's wrath are often seen as synonymous, so I'll go back over to their view. Looking at, for instance, just by example, the Pretrib rapture has this entire 7-year slice cut in half at the midpoint, and then the Great Tribulation is the second 3.5 years. By comparison, the mid-tribulation just simply takes all of God's wrath and overlays it with the... Wow, that was horrible, because I walked out. Oh, let's try that again. They take the Great Tribulation and just define it as synonymous with God's wrath. They're both the same thing, according to this chart. Post-trib rapture in the lower left corner, by comparison, is understands God's wrath to be the full 7 years, but when we cut that thing in half, then we get Great Tribulation, similar to the Pretrib rapture, in fact identical on this chart. Great Tribulation is only the last 3.5 years. Pretrib rapture, so now we can go back over to, give me a second. There we go. Pretrib rapture, what do they say about the Great Tribulation? The blue part on the right, Great Tribulation is distinct from God's wrath. This tribulation is Satan's wrath on believers. More and more post-tribbers are starting to realize the benefit of calling the Great Tribulation God's wrath, instead of just calling I'm sorry, let me try that one again. That was wrong. More and more post-tribbers are starting to recognize the benefit of labeling the Great Tribulation as Satan's wrath and distinct from God's wrath, because they're realizing that one of the signature features and one of the reasons why we Prewrathers push it so hard excuse me, about the Great Tribulation being labeled as Satan's wrath and not God's wrath is because of the concept that God has already told us in 1 Thessalonians 5:9 that we are not appointed to wrath, number one. But number two, when we look at the scope of why God's wrath needs to be poured out on planet Earth, it is a time of retribution and judgment and punishment against wicked, unrepentant sinners, and a time for God to judge the Antichrist beast system. And when you realize that from a biblical perspective, that God's church, God's bride, is not connected to those two people groups, i.e. either unrepentant, wicked humanity or Satan's beast system, when you realize that God's people stand in antithesis to those other groups, we are not labeled as by God's word as unrepentant sinners because we've been cleansed by the blood of Messiah. God no longer reckons to our account a punishment that is needed to condemn us. Indeed, Paul said it best in Romans 8, there's therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. So it's not necessary for Christians to experience the wrath of God in a punitive fashion. We don't need to be punished by God in that way. We do need to go through the wrath of Satan because that's what will help us actually be purged of the impurities that we're infected with, meaning it will allow us to strengthen our belief in Yeshua. It will allow those who are in the church who are in name only to prove that they are just Christian in name only. It'll give them a chance to take their stand for God or for Satan. They will either embrace the Antichrist and his mark system, proving that they were never part of the church, or they'll stand their ground and lose their life for their faith in their Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Again, proving that they are part of the body of Messiah. So it's necessary for the church to go into a great tribulation. But it's not necessary for the church to go through the wrath of God. So that's why we make this distinction, and it's unfortunate that classic post-tribbers, have not been very careful with that distinction. Up until now, they're starting to, I think, pick up on that. I could be wrong. My indictment could be wrong. My description of them could be wrong. But in my understanding of the way they articulate what they believe about tribulation versus wrath of God, many of the charts don't seem to do a very good job of explaining that. Prewrath does their best. All right, moving along to the left side of the screen in the orange or cheese-colored, or it's supposed to be orange, the aspect color. I couldn't make it too dark. I'll try and keep it on top so you know. I couldn't make it too dark because then you couldn't read the writing underneath. Key scriptures that go along with each view. In the green, which is the post-trib, we've got passages like Matthew 24:29-31, where it talks about immediately after the tribulation of those days, and it talks about the gathering together, and then the coming on the I'm butchering it. Let me just pull it up and show you the main parts that I was wanting to highlight. Here we go.